Please rise if you are able for the presentation of colors by American Legion Post 370 Honor Guard.
Post color!
Please remain standing as we join in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You may now be seated. Today we are gathered to remember and honor Pearl Harbor survivors as well as other veterans of World War II for their sacrifices in the fight for freedom. We would also like to recognize veterans and current members of the armed services who are actively engaged in the protection of freedom throughout the world. We ask that you stand or raise your hand as we honor those who have served in the United States Air Force, the United States Army, the United States Coast Guard, the United States Marine Corps, and the United States Navy. Thank you all for your service. I would like to now reintroduce Penn Almany, who is our Director of Parks and Recreation. He will share a short history of our Pearl Harbor Memorial Park here in Mission.
Thank you, Mayor. So Pearl Harbor Memorial Park was dedicated in 2004 after a request by a Mission resident and Pearl Harbor survivor Dorwin Lampkin, who was also looking for a way to honor all survivors. Members of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association worked to secure funding for the park's benches, which you can see here, which are engraved with the names of the 56 surviving Pearl Harbor veterans who were living in eastern Kansas at the time. The anchor that rises above the park is on permanent loan from the U.S. Navy. Pearl Harbor Memorial Park is home to a relic from the USS Arizona, which is housed on the opposite side of this picture here. This relic was secured by Mr. Lampkin and added to the park in 2010. The park has hosted many events throughout the years, including VJ Day and Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, and most recently, a memorial tree planting ceremony recognizing Dorwin Lampkin's efforts. Speaking of efforts, I'd like to recognize the advocacy and tireless efforts of our dear friend Susan Pepperdine, who died on March 27, 2022. She was an ardent supporter of the veterans through many channels, including Fish, Friends in Service of Heroes, and the instrumental leader of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. We will miss her and her many contributions. Lastly, I'd like to recognize Dorinda Nicholson, who is visiting with us today. Thank you, Dorinda. She was 6 years old during the attack when her family lived by Pearl Harbor. Her book, Pearl Harbor Child, describes her experiences, and we appreciate that she continues to share her story with both children and adults internationally. We are pleased to introduce our speaker, D.M. Giangreco, who is well known for authoring the book, Hell to Pay, Operation Downfall, and the Invasion of Japan, 1945 to 47, which was released in 2017. This year, he also introduced his most recent book, Truman and the Bomb. So we welcome D.M. Giangreco.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here today. Over the course of the last, really, I guess about 40 years, I've either interviewed formally or talked with or read the interviews, recorded and taped of a little bit over 1,400 veterans of World War II. So it's a subject I'm pretty close to. And, thinking about Pearl Harbor, you hear the number 2,317 and sometimes 2,403. These are the figures one usually hears, for killed in action or died of wounds from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Terrible numbers, but of course they're only a piece of the story. The Japanese attack left more than 9,000 sailors without ships. And that figure included about 1,000 wounded and injured who were returned to duty actually fairly quickly. Now, what happened with these, sailors, these survivors of the attack? None of the ships in the Pacific at that time were fully crewed, something that probably you folks are very familiar with. And the Arizona itself was short by 200 some men. And almost to a man, these sailors went to fill out existing ships in the Pacific and those from the West Coast arriving at Pearl. Large numbers of these men, very possibly more than half of them, would soon find themselves engaged in the long series of 1942 naval actions in the Solomons, where 29 more American ships went to the bottom, including 2 fleet carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 17 destroyers. In short, they were not out of the war just because they had survived Pearl Harbor. Also, it's important to mention that of the roughly 600 to 650 shipboard Marines at Pearl on December 6th, 109 were killed that day, and again, most of them were on the Arizona, where 73 of the 88 aboard died. Now, these Marine survivors were swept up, very, very quickly swept up into the 1st Marine Division and ended up at a place called Guadalcanal the following year, then Cape Gloucester, then Peleliu, then Okinawa. Pearl Harbor survivors fought and died in every major action in the Pacific. The year after Guadalcanal, the first black recipient of the Navy Cross was among the roughly 650 men killed when the carrier Liscome Bay was torpedoed near Macon and Tarawa in November 1943. And it's likely, very likely, that he was not the only Pearl Harbor survivor aboard the Liscome Bay, and he, with other Pearl Harbor survivors, had initially been assigned to the heavy cruiser Indianapolis a week after the surprise attack on Pearl. The Indianapolis itself was sunk with staggering losses just before the Japanese surrender in 1945. Heart-wrenching as all of this is, these deaths among those who had been at Pearl Harbor were only a tiny fragment of the bloodletting by young Americans. The United States had entered the war late, and because of its sheer distance from Europe and the Western Pacific, it did not begin to experience the casualties comparable to those of the other belligerents until the conflict's final year, really. The period from June 1944 to June 1945, from, say, the invasion at Normandy and in Europe and the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, was referred to after the war by Army planners as the casualty surge. By then, the U.S. Army alone, not including Marines and Navy, but the U.S. Army alone was losing soldiers at a rate that Americans today, would find astounding, suffering an average of 65,000 killed, wounded, and missing each and every month during the casualty surge of 44, 45, with the November, December, and January figures standing at a stunning 72,000, 88,000, and 79,000 respectively in post-war tabulations. It's been an honor to speak with a lot of these folks. And Bill True of the 101st Airborne Division, which fought and he himself had fought in Normandy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, found that, quote, in the heat of a battle, you don't mourn a fallen comrade. Years later is when you really feel it and really mourn buddies that died. Johnny Stepko was a little guy and one of the youngest guys in the company. To stand at his grave in Normandy and know that I've lived a full life and had children and grandchildren, that he'll always be a boy who died there. And another veteran, Wally Parr, said, I think the best thing is if you can think of all of those who made the supreme sacrifice. Remember the real meaning of that. They gave away all of their tomorrows for our today. And again, thank you for inviting me here today.
Dennis, we appreciate you sharing those interesting, insightful pieces of history and quotes. I'd now like to introduce Mike Shannon, who's a Vietnam veteran and former radio and television personality, who will be reading the names of local Pearl Harbor survivors. Mike?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Two marble benches in the Pearl Harbor Memorial Park feature the names of 56 servicemen who were members of the local chapter of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. I'm going to read the names of the fallen comrades. The tolling of a bell after each name will serve as a tribute to their service. Let's begin. Carl Appleberry, John Berry, John Babcock, Joe Brandt, Jimmy Black, Orville Brewer, Jack Carson, Carl Christensen, Eddie Christensen, John Coburn, Raymond Kozak, Jesse Dunnigan, Buddy Durant, Ralph Geringer, James Geitz, Louis Graham, Mose Gross, Gordon Haley, Harold Hall, James Harvey, Harry Helmsing, Charles Hine, Robert Holcomb, James Jackson, Woodrow Jones, Jack Jorgensen, Almond Carr, David Keller, James Kennedy, Fritz Croft, Dorwin Lampkin, Edward Lyons, Stanley Levitt, Donald Lowry, H.P. Monslow, Vernon Moore, Eugene Perkins, Clifford Pitts, Francis Riley, Charles Reicher, Robert Rowlands, Edmund Russell, Edgeliff Schmidt, Don Spitzendorf, Ken Spry, Vern Stevens, Kenneth Stevens, H.O. Turner, William Tucker, Cliff Walton, Robert Wheeler, William Widener, Richard Williams, Norman Winkler, John Yates, Robert Zillner. And that completes the list. Taps will now be played courtesy of the American Legion Post Honor Guard. In a few minutes they will.
Please stand and join me, if you're able, in a final remembrance of our veterans of World War II in the Pacific Theater during the placement of the wreath by the American Legion Post 370 on Honor Guard. You can now be seated. We appreciate everyone's attendance today. We hope you've enjoyed the spirit in which it was presented and the reverence we hold for all of those who participated in our freedoms. If you haven't already, please visit Pearl Harbor Memorial Park in person. DMG and Greco will be available to answer any questions you may have in the next few minutes. Thank you again for participating in today's ceremony in remembrance of Pearl Harbor.